Hello friends, I am so excited to tell you about Independent Media Token. Independent Media Token is a brand new way to show your support for independent media without having to donate a dime. Independent Media Token is a cryptocurrency on the Solana blockchain designed to generate funds to promote and foster the growth of independent content creators, allowing them to engage in their art without having to worry about being demonetized. Through a network of media partners, of which you yourself can become a part of, Independent Media Token's goal is to ensure the powers that be can never cut off all of our areas of funding and censor the only free voices left in the world. Join the movement today. You can pick up Independent Media Token using Phantom Wallet or the Solana wallet of your choice, where you can easily swap your Solana for IMT. Grab some IMT today and remember to always know your team. To learn more, visit independentmediatoken.com or use the link right in the description.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts. You have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Steven Snider. Be sure to check out my films. Doors of Perception is available on Amazon Prime. Occult Louisiana, featuring Steven Snider, is available on Tubi, Roku, Apple, and many more streaming platforms. We're booking guests for October. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome back to the show Steven Snider. He is an author and longtime curator of the ViseUp website, which is dedicated to parapolitics and high weirdness in all their many forms. With Frank Zero of Zero Night, he co-hosts The Farm, a weekly podcast dedicated to parapolitics and synchromysticism. Steven, welcome back. How you doing?
Not too bad, sir.
It's great to have you back on. It's been a little while. Today we're going to take an extremely deep dive into the possible connections between the Annunciation shooter and an online death cult that may be inducing demonic possession. The implications are incredible and may even involve very high-level individuals and groups. So much to get to, but before we do, it's been a while. Remind the audience a little bit about yourself and let them know how they can find out more about you.
Well, I am the longtime curator of the ViseUp blog, which I don't really do much with anymore, but you can still find a wealth of material, probably several books worth there. I'm also the host of the Farm podcast, which typically has a new episode out every Monday and is available on all the major platforms, Apple, Spotify, and so forth. Also, I do the Farm Patreon with additional episodes, State of the Union addresses that recount a lot of current events and so forth. And I'm also the author of multiple books. The most recent one was Weird Tales, which dealt with a lot of recent events that have unfolded in 2025, starting with the Zithian, the whole affair around that, and also a lot of the geopolitical implications of the kind of current shakeup that's ongoing amongst the ruling elites, which seems to have worked its way out, I suppose. You basically now have Peter Thiel and a lot of these other people from the PayPal mafia in the driver's seat. But that is, I suppose, only tangentially related to the whole thing with the school shooters, though maybe not quite as separate as it would initially seem. So the most recent event we had was the Annunciation Catholic Church shooting, which happened on August 27th, 2025. And one of the interesting things about this is that it happened near Minneapolis, Minnesota. I believe the specific area was Wyndon, if I recall correctly. But for those of you listening to this, you probably still recall this because it's relatively fresh in everybody's mind. But you had the state representative that was assassinated in Minneapolis on June 14th, 2025, Melissa Hortman, who was also killed along with her husband at their home at the time. And then earlier in the day, there had been an attempted assassination of State Senator John Hoffman as well, along with his wife. And in both cases, the shooter was Vance Bolter, who left a very interesting, let's just say, orgy of evidence following the shootings. Specifically, I'm thinking of the No Kings flyers that were left in his car. Of course, this was sort of unfolding at the time when you had the No Kings protest breaking out. You had the one in Utah over the same weekend that had a shooting occur at one of the rallies in Salt Lake City. So there were a lot of interesting developments unfolding during that whole time frame. So Bolter was trying to make it seem like he was affiliated with No Kings and was some kind of radical leftist, even though he had only really targeted Democrats. And the only evidence for this, I believe, was a bipartisan commission that Tim Walz, the governor, had appointed him to several years ago. There's no doubt, though, that Bolter was involved with a very militant Christian network centered around dominionism. Specifically, he had ties to the Kansas City Prophets and the New Apostolic Reformation movement. Bizarrely, one of his mentors, I believe the person he accredited with his conversion, had murdered in South Africa back in the Zimbabwe, back in the late 1980s. So there were just a lot of very strange things about Bolter. So that shooting occurred on June 14th. So about 2 or so months, a little over 2 months later, you have the whole incident at the Catholic Church with Robin Westman. There were approximately 116 rounds fired. My understanding is, like, what happened is there was a school-wide mass that had been called at about 8:15. Robin Westman had barricaded the exits to the church building, and at about 8:30, she had opened fire at the students in there. About 20 were wounded, with 2 being killed. They were 8 and 10 years old. I believe I've mentioned it, but there were roughly 116 rounds fired. I believe one of the guns had jammed on Westman, who had ultimately committed suicide after the initial volley of bullets. I believe the shooting lasted approximately about 2 minutes. One thing I will point out about this, and not to diminish the tragedy, but Westman seems to have been an awful shot. 116 rounds at targets in a confined space like that, and only killing 2. Again, I mean, I'm thankful that she only killed 2. Don't misunderstand me, but let's just say, like, somebody who had been through special operations training or had been trained by an actual operator would probably kill a lot more people in a confined space like that with 116 rounds fired. So there was at least that Westman seems to have not been an especially good shot. So there's already been a tremendous amount of speculation about Westman, their motives for all of this. You've seen the whole sort of gauntlet being rolled out there. Of course, predictively, you've seen a lot of people try to talk about psychotropic drugs, and amusingly enough, apparently Robert Kennedy Jr. has vowed to open an investigation into that. Probably should indicate how serious a lot of this was. Westman apparently had gone through a breakup shortly before the shooting, was living at some sort of unspecified person's house. But again, I mean, how much romantic things would have involved with this is debatable. The New York Post proposed somehow Westman working in a pot shop up to 2 weeks before the shooting was a factor. I couldn't actually bring
Working in
myself
what
to
did you
read
say?
that article,
I'm sorry.
but I'll just throw it out there.
They she was working
The
in
New
what?
York Post proposed that Westman work in
Oh, okay, okay.
a
Gotcha,
pot
gotcha,
shop, cannabis
gotcha.
shop, head shop, up to 2 weeks before the shooting was a factor. Like I said, I couldn't bring myself to read that one. So yeah, but it's been proposed like many other
Okay.
things. So the big one that's getting a lot of the sound bites right now was Westman being transgender. Apparently Westman had changed their name around 2019, if I remember correctly. But as recently as I had looked this up, and it was a few days ago, I didn't get a chance to check this before we started recording. But most recently, when I looked at this, Westman had not started to medically transition yet. So there seems to be some question about that, and I could be mistaken. Maybe she did. I just, at the time, though, when I was doing research on this, there was a question of whether or not they had actually begun the process of physically transitioning or not.
Yeah.
For me, what was really intriguing about it were some of the allegations that possession had been involved in the shooting. And of course, I mean, there was sort of the low hanging fruits around this. Westman had decided to shoot up a Catholic school with school children in it, and there was also the bizarre drawing that Westman had done of herself, essentially depicting herself staring in a mirror with a rifle slung over her shoulder, and this sort of demonic figure staring back at her, which was really quite peculiar. But just looking beyond that, if you go, for instance, and look at the video that she had posted on YouTube, I believe it was the evening before the shooting was to occur, but it was really quite disturbing on so many levels. But there definitely seems to be just something very, very off about the person, the way that they're talking about everything in this video. And it sort of reminds me, honestly, in conversations that I've had with mentally ill people in DC, for instance, who I honestly had to wonder in those cases if they were, maybe there was a little something up with them as
Right,
well. But
right.
the point being, just the whole behavior and everything about Westman is just very, very peculiar. And the video is just extremely unsettling on so many levels.
Let's talk a little bit about the other things that were brought up in conspiratorial circles, like the dad being involved with the CIA.
I mean, I know he went to Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, Madison, which does have a lot of very strange connections to it. But beyond that, I wasn't really seeing like anything. Again, I haven't looked at that for a couple of days, but I can't recall anything that had directly jumped out to me that he would have been involved specifically in the CIA. I feel like, I mean, when stuff like this happens, people are so obsessed with like trying to draw some sort of like direct links to like an intelligence service. And
Yeah,
I feel like people aren't really getting that, like it's moved beyond that. I mean, the days of like the sort of classic Gladio setup where you had like case officers and operators that were managing assets in the field, and I mean, MK Ultra artichoke type techniques that were done to
right.
them to maybe make them a little bit more vigorous in pursuing their ends. I mean, it's not to say that this kind of stuff doesn't happen now, but with the way that technology has advanced, I mean, the intelligence services really, really do not need to directly try to manage these people the way that they did years ago. And I mean, for me, looking into this, that was what I really gravitated towards specifically, was the cult that Westman seems to have become involved with online, in which, I mean, a lot of people don't seem to have really talked a lot about.
Yeah, tell us more
But
about that.
that is I guess, for lack of a better term, it's referred to as saints culture. Again, that's not my phrase. This is what some academics have come up with. So, like, roughly speaking, it kind of started to develop around 2015 after Dylan Roof's shooting spree. And it was really pushed by an online group that was known as the Bowl Patrol. And they were so named because of Roof's distinct bowl cut haircut. And it led to just an absolute reverence for him, to the point that he was essentially turned into a saint. So you had first a podcast that was started called the Bowl Podcast by an individual using the pseudonym Vic Mackey, which was oh gosh, that was the name of the cop in The Shield, if I remember correctly, the corrupt one. He was later outed in 2020, but I can't remember the guy's name now off the top of my head. But anyway, under the pseudonym Vic Mackey, this podcast started going, dedicated to a lot of the reference around Dylan Roof. It spread to a lot of Discord and Telegram groups and so forth. And gradually, you started seeing more people that were brought into the pantheon of saints. I think one of the first ones was Robert Bowers, after Ruth, that is to say, who allegedly killed 11 people inside the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. I think this would have been 2017 or 2018. But the thing about this that was interesting is that Mackey claimed that Bowers had followed him on Gab and that the two had interacted in direct messages and so forth. Though I want to emphasize, I don't know that it has ever been confirmed, but nonetheless, he did claim that he had had contacts with Bowers before the shooting. So Bowers goes into the pantheon. And you've got some more people that are brought into it. One of them is Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch, New Zealand shooter who killed 51 people at a mosque in March 2019. And again, if you watch Westman's videos, there are a ton of references to Tarrant. You see the number 51 written on several of his weapons and so forth. So he was definitely a fan of what he did at Christchurch. So after that, the Bowl Patrol added John Ernest, who killed one person at a synagogue in San Diego County, October 2019. And then there was Patrick Crusius, I believe, who killed 22 people inside an El Paso and Walmart in February 2020. So it's interesting that you've got a lot of these spree killers at this point in time. These were mostly affiliated with rather openly far-right causes. In a lot of cases, such as the Christchurch shooter, they're trying to kill Muslims and so forth. But one thing that I do find interesting about a lot of the deaths that are linked to the saints culture is that they do occur in a lot of places of worship. You obviously have with the Annunciation shooting a Catholic church. I just talked about the Christchurch one, which was at a mosque. There have been several synagogues that have been targeted as well. In the case of, what was his name? Wade Michael Page, the Wisconsin shooter. Oh, I think it was 2012. He actually shot up a Sikh temple in Wisconsin. So he was also put in the pantheon. But it's very interesting that so many of these shootings did occur at places of worship and that a lot of cases they did target children as well. So this is another reason why I think the Bowl Patrol and the whole Saints culture was a very strong influence on Westman. And I'll get to some more concrete links here in a second. But after Mackey was outed around 2020, the Bowl Patrol started kind of going into decline. But the Saints culture had really started to proliferate on a lot of Telegram channels, and specifically, they were the ones that were part of the so-called Telegram Collective. And that's a group of content creators dedicated to perpetuating accelerationist violence. This was managed through a combination of images and manuals, which the Saints culture was a crucial component of in terms of making people idolize a lot of these murderers and so forth. So a lot of these core saints, I mean, basically they're set up as like role models to be worshipped and emulated by the people that were a part of these circles. And each individual triggered by the saints had the possibility of achieving sainthood from themselves following the killing. So it's kind of curious how they did that in the sense that it almost becomes a sort of self-replicating death cult, if you will. So it's really starting to take off around this time. And some more background on Telegram. Again, this is a network that's also had links to groups like the 764, to the Order of Nine Angles, and so forth. So
Really?
there's a lot of very militant accelerationists that are tied up with the whole Telegram milieu. So anyway, also on Telegram, like the whole criteria for a saint started to expand. And eventually, by I believe around the end of 2020, they had a list of approximately 50 of these saints. So you've got some predictable people that were brought into it. Anders Breivik, for instance, was brought into the list along with Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, cult leader Jim Jones, Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh, Martin Luther King assassin James Earl Ray, sovereign citizen Terrence Gordon Call, Fred W. Cohen was on it, who's an interesting one. He was the Valentine Day shooter that had been linked to the Son of Sam cult. Breivik, of course, was plastered all over some of Westman's weapons. Big influence, clearly. Was also a shout out to Ted K on one of the weapons as well. The ambiguous Ted Kaczynski that everybody absolutely loves in these groups. So the whole concept of the sainthood really started to crystallize the following year in 2021. And that was also, I believe, when there was a whole Telegram channel that was launched dedicated to them. And one of the strangest things that came out of this were these so-called saints cards, which were almost like these digital baseball cards that were being spread around. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to quote here from an article, The Lineage of Violence, Saints Culture, and Militant Accelerationism by Jonathan Lewis, Joshua Malley, and Graham Macklin, because the whole thing with these Saints cards is just really bizarre. And I thought they did a great way of encompassing it. So it goes, quote, "These channels published monthly calendars celebrating the dates of far-right attacks and marked other milestones, including the arrests, deaths, and even birthdays of perpetrators. Propagandists also produced fact sheet graphics that broke down the details of each attack into easily readable paragraphs alongside the death toll and the number of wounded, attack method and status of each killer, alongside a montage of their photos, pictures of their weapons, and crime scenes. The graphics, which resemble collectible trading cards, as I just said, are known as Saints cards. The highly networked nature of the Telegram facility, Saints commemoration across Telegram, as Saint cards are forwarded throughout the network on the anniversary of attacks. Each card includes a further reading section that directs users to manifestos, articles, or documentaries so followers can educate themselves about each attacker and their crimes. The reappearance of links to additional crime scene photos or websites like Murderpedia highlights how Telegram grafts a macabre fascination with violence and death to broadcasting a rolling curriculum. The calendar-style promotion of saints further ritualizes the glorification, which aims to inspire further attacks with a steady stream of examples of saints with high scores to be beaten. In addition, some admins of channels have encouraged members to celebrate the anniversary of attacks by editing, sharing new visual propaganda glorifying the attacks, illustrating interaction between important dates, and the preparatory media culture of Telegram. As highlighted by Winkler et al., in the database analysis of extremist groups for GNet, symbolically significant dates can strengthen the collective identity of groups and provide important cues for audience members to reinforce beliefs and model their behaviors on. The Saints counter marks dates important for Telegram identity formation, inspires continued content creation, and promotion of future violence.
Whoa.
So you basically have this whole pantheon developed. You've got like these glorified baseball cards celebrating
Was
it.
Robin in possession
And like
of these
the
cards?
actual Catholic saints, they've released. I don't know. That would be something really interesting to look into.
Yeah.
There were some other indications, but yes, it would be really, really interesting to know if he had any of these Saints
Right,
cards.
right. But he was involved
So
with these
there's been a
online groups,
lot of
though,
effort.
right?
Well, on one of his rifles, he had bull pilled written on it. I've got the screen
Yeah,
cap for
yeah.
that. So I don't know what else he would necessarily be referring to when he's got the names of all of the other saints right spread across his weapons. I mean, that's like kind of the thing about this is, I mean, it's almost like he's ritualizing his
Yeah.
weapons with like sigils and runes or something like that, like the Norse would have put on their swords or something for these
Right.
attacks. And it's all with these saints' names on
That is so crazy.
So, I mean, this is really some serious stuff that's been put up. Um, so, uh, all right. So the first killer who was actually directly linked to Satan's culture that we know for sure was Jaya Krajcik, I believe, who was a Slovakian extreme rightist. So in 2022, killed two people and injured a third one outside an LGBTQ plus bar in Bratislava, I believe, on October 12th, 2022. Krajcik actually directly thanked a Telegram channel in kind for it and hailed the saints and so forth. Finally, you had in 2024 a Turkish teenager, Arda K, who also stabbed five people and live streamed it on Telegram and also was hoping to be brought into the saints. But they denied him because he wasn't white. However, there was an expansion, a further expansion of saints culture. And that happened when it started to integrate with the true crime community, which I find to be fascinating. If you've ever seen that old show from the 90s, Millennium, it deals a lot with actually demonic possession. There's like this one scene where a group of demons are sitting around having coffee and they're like discussing the different ways that people can like damn themselves. And one person brings up true crime and they all kind of like laugh knowingly at that. So yeah, true crime. That's a lot of interesting stuff comes out of that.
Yes.
So you already had like a lot of this veneration in true crime, especially, I mean, for a lot of like the school shooters and so forth. But once Saints culture got in this, you started having Anna Blands, the John Holmes, the James Holmes, the Columbine shooters, Charles Whitman, and Robert Crimo III were all sort of brought into the pantheon. And Cremo definitely would have had a big influence on Westman. And I say that because of the heavy use of the cross of endlessness that Westman had on her weapons. The cross of endlessness is actually a relatively new symbol, but it was appropriated by Cremo when he made just this bizarre video flashing the cross of endlessness before the shooting spree that he personally engaged in. So it seems like because of Cremo, the cross of endlessness, I mean, has almost become this sort of charged sigil, if you will, within these circles. So again, it's really, really interesting that Westman had all of this stuff scrawled over his weapons. Another thing, too, sort of like returning to that strange picture that he had drawn of herself staring at the mirror with the demon staring back at her. See, I mean, that obviously kind of brings to mind scrying initially, but it had actually made me think somewhat of the process of reality shifting, which really became popular among a lot of Zoomers, especially during the lockdowns and so forth. And Westman would have definitely been in the same age frame for that. But within like reality shifting, they had this whole thing called like the mirror method, which became a popular technique for shifting reality. So you basically stand in a dark room with a mirror and some other light source between you. Normally it would be like a candle or something. Stare at the mirror and image it, you know, and imagine yourself in another reality. And you essentially would keep staring until hallucinations start to reflect back. It's kind of like an induced form of hypnosis, if you will. So this is kind of like what makes me wonder with like Westman. I mean, he's in this situation where he's being told to closely identify with all of these saints and so forth. Does she eventually try to essentially open herself up to possession from them? That would be, I think, one way you could potentially infer the drawings of the mirror and perhaps what actually stared back at her if she did attempt something like this.
That's so interesting. I had a guest recently that's been looking into the possibility of an epidemic of younger people that are involved with black magic or some sort of occult rituals because of groups that they're involved with online and things that they've seen online, which seems to be related to this.
Well, I mean, it's not specifically black magic, I would say. I mean, rather what happens with a lot of these like kind of subcultures like reality shifting and stuff is it's like they're introduced to a lot of these techniques that are rooted in magic, but it's not like understood as such. And a lot of times, I mean, they even try to like frame some of this stuff around like psychological terminology and things like that. But it kind of goes back to how a lot of these techniques have been masked and so forth. So, like, the basic process of how like Renaissance magicians would have understood possession would be very similar to how we would think of memes
Mm.
essentially manifesting, if you will. So Giordano Bruno had advocated that you use the whole process of fantasy, which would be spelled Phantasy. So, in order to do this, for the magician to take a hold of the audience, first you need the actual audience to be true believers. That's an important thing. Belief is crucial to the whole process. The magician
Mm.
and his audience need to have some inclination to believe in what the magician is doing. So, next, the magician would craft fantasy or a phantasm, excuse me, which would be an image, which would then enter into the target's fantasia, which would be the imagination. Okay. Again, this is essentially the same way that like a meme would work when you get it into somebody's imagination, i.e., bypassing their conscious mind and into their subconscious. From there, it passes into a full blown fantasy within their psyche. And this is what Bruno dubbed to be the chain of chains. You get the right image in there that triggers the right associations in somebody's mind, it can have profound effects to them. So over the years, this sort of process was tied in with the whole art of theurgy and so forth, which has to do with the notion of drawing down or ascending your consciousness to the heavenly spheres or drawing down a planetary consciousness, gods, things like that, into either yourself or
Mm.
possession or objects. I mean, you kind of have the whole notion of like talking statues in Egypt, for instance. That would be sort of a branch of theurgy. But essentially, it was sort of combined with Bruno's notion of like images. He got that from the art of memory, and then he combined it with concepts of theurgy. And it led to this notion that certain images, signals, symbols, things like that could essentially trigger a kind of collective unconscious in the person who is viewing them, like something other could enter into their imagination and take hold, if you
Yeah.
will. So these techniques eventually spread to the arts. Started with symbolism. The original symbolist movement that grew up in France in the late 19th century pretty much came entirely out of the Rosicrucian circles there, the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross. The big guy behind that body was Josephine Paladin. Paladin had a real specific purpose as far as art went. He wanted to destroy realism in art.
Hmm.
So he started promoting a lot of these avant-garde movements like the symbolists. And the whole purpose was essentially to create a sort of art that would address somebody's subconscious, largely bypassing their conscious mind and influence them in that fashion.
Yeah.
And symbolism was basically the basis for surrealism, for Dadaism, for a lot of the big avant-garde movements that grew up in the early 20th century. And the symbolists and the surrealists developed a lot of really elaborate techniques for manipulating audiences. And it wasn't just applied to painting and things like that. They started to apply a lot of this stuff to plays, to a lot of things like that. And they also sort of hit on like an early concept of memes. So they really understood
Hmm.
the importance of repetition, how you could make words almost incantational through that process, the use of certain colors to trigger associations, sounds, things like that. So all of this stuff became codified as sort of artistic techniques by the surrealists. And eventually, a lot of the great directors, for instance, adopted them. And if you're really doubting like what I'm saying, that these techniques could really ravage somebody's, subconscious, you need to look no further than the whole cult that has grown up around Stanley Kubrick to see just how effective these techniques
Hmm.
are. Stanley Kubrick was the greatest director in the history of cinema as far as feature-length films is concerned. He was a complete master of the medium, and that is because he understood all of these techniques implicitly. A lot of the stuff in Kubrick movies that should theoretically make them unwatchable was taken directly from symbolist and surrealist techniques. So one of the things I would point to would be the atrocious characters in Kubrick's movies. There's no attempt at realism for the characters in his films. They're marionettes, they're caricatures, and that was completely a technique of the symbolists. The characters aren't supposed to be fully realized. They're supposed to be something that the audience can project their own concerns onto. The deliberate pacing of Kubrick's movies, that's something else that was taken from symbolism. It's done to break the audience's conception of time as the film is unfolding. Also, just the repeated or the use of repetition that Kubrick was so fond of. I mean, you can really see that heavily used in like Eyes Wide Shut, for example. Tom Cruise just constantly repeats lines that somebody else had just said to him throughout. All of this, all of these techniques individually aren't like a big deal, but when you combine all of them together, it really, really warps somebody's perceptions when they're watching a Kubrick film in terms of the time that's going on, different associations that can come out of watching one. And I mean, when he's really at his best with like The Shining, I mean, you can just see this. The Shining is almost like a reflective surface. You can see almost anything your subconscious brings into that film reflected back to you. I mean, one time, like I went in watching it thinking that it was like a metaphor for the murder of Frank Lloyd Wright's mistress, Taliesin, in 1914. And sure enough, I was seeing constant allusions to this every scene in The Shining. But you can do the same thing for the genocide of indigenous people, for child abuse, for Kubrick founding the space program. I mean, you can pretty much apply almost any interpretation.
A couple of my buddies just made a movie about it being about MK Ultra.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, it can be basically about anything. I mean, some of his movies were more specific, but that's where I think The Shining is just such an amazing piece of art in and of itself, because it has this uncanny ability of reflecting the viewer's subconscious back to them. So Kubrick could basically build a cult using these techniques, and probably not even intentionally on his part. And again, I mean, if you don't think that this is a cult, just look at the proliferation of YouTube videos of everything online, analyzing just the most minute details of Stanley Kubrick's films. So this is what Kubrick's movies have done to a whole generation of people. So imagine if you're taking these techniques and you're weaponizing them with the specific intention of creating a cult, of inducing possession and mental collapse in people. Because in my estimation, that is very much possible if somebody is a total mastery of their arts, the way a guy like Kubrick would be.
Earlier, you were talking about how mind control programs, these assassin creation, experimentation, they aren't as hands-on as they used to be. That people can now be basically remotely triggered in a sense, possibly by the combination of these drugs, certain influences online. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
Well, I'd say it was more the influences online. I mean, again, I don't totally discount how something like psychotropic drugs could factor in. But again, when you consider how many people in the United States are on psychotropic drugs in relation to those that become shooters, I mean, I guess it becomes a little bit more problematic. But like, I mean, getting into like sort of what I see happening with sort of the manifestation of Gladio in like the 21st century, I think you would have to look at something like the Order of Nine Angles. So there's been a lot of disputes whether the O9A was a part of Gladio from back in the day. That sort of factors around the figure of David Myatt, who, depending upon, like, I mean, who you read, was either the founder or the guy who codified the ideology, whatever. But he was involved with Combat 18 starting in the 1970s, which was a militant paramilitary group in the UK. And I believe that it's spread to other parts of Europe as well. But there's been a lot of speculation over the years that Combat 18 was a part of the UK's Gladio network. And again, that would be fairly consistent with what has come out about Gladio in Italy and some of the other countries where there have been serious investigations, namely that they often had right-wing groups, paramilitaries that were being used by intelligence services and special operations forces for a variety of activities, often at times involving terrorism to sort of fulfill the so-called strategy of tension, if you will. So Maya had those potential connections, and then later you've got the Temple of Blood guy, Sutter. I can't remember his first name now off the top of my head, but there's been a pretty conclusive amount of evidence that's come out that this guy, for instance, was an FBI informant and has been active in the community since, I guess, at least around the early noughts or something like that. So when you sort of step back and look at some of the broader structure of the O9A, you can see some of these connections. But the brilliance of the Order of Nine Angles is that it sort of exists more like a spiritual order. And what I mean by that is how the original Rosicrucian fervor sort of played out. Because there wasn't an actual Rosicrucian group when the manifestos appeared in the early 17th century. Of course, later there were all these attempts to create actual Rosicrucian orders. I just mentioned one before, the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Cross, and a lot of these brought all of this, kind of Masonic grades, and they had physical lodges and all this other stuff. But that really missed the point. Being a Rosicrucian is a lot like being like a Discordian or a Fordian, right? It's a way of life. It's how you present yourself, how you go about things. It's adopting a certain morality and trying to live your life according to those principles and so forth. I mean, this is why, like, Jacques Vallée, as Christopher Knowles has told me, has proclaimed himself a Rosicrucian.
Yeah.
You don't go out and join a lodge or something. You just got to live like a Rosicrucian. So that was the sort of the whole purpose of the Rosicrucian manifestos originally. They wanted to create a spiritual order of people who were living according to Rosicrucian principles. They didn't want a bunch of like old white guys just getting together with like masks and stuff and sitting around and trying to go up with grades and this other shit. And that was essentially the whole view that the O9A was taking in terms of being a spiritual order. So you put out these rituals online, and this is another parallel to the Order of Nine Angles has with Rosicrucianism. Big part of why Rosicrucianism was successful and spread so much is because of the invention of the printing press. Very cheap now to manufacture the manifestos so they could be widely spread. O9A is in the same boat. They were right there at the onset of the internet when they started to take off in the late 80s, early 90s. They were able to get a lot of this literature online, and it is spread all over the place. And it has metamorphosized, it's evolved. You see it turning up in a lot of sectors where you wouldn't expect it. I mean, one of the things I was really intrigued by when I was looking into the Zithians, for example, was that Ziz was actually using some O9A terminology, specifically references to a casualty and things like that, a casual. So that's a big thing in the O9A with the whole connection of casualty and a casualty and the different sort of worlds with the Nexions and all that other stuff. So you can see how it'll just turn up in groups like that surely you would not think would be directly receptive to something like the Order of Nine Angles. But that's kind of the brilliance of the O9A. A lot of the stuff that they're coming up with, it's very sophisticated. Give the devil his due. It's easy to see why this stuff is very seductive to intelligent people. This is a lot more cutting edge, frankly, than just the same tired, OTO, Crowley, Kenneth Grant stuff that's still being put out there. This, I mean, I think a lot, along with like a lot of the stuff that the Cybernetic Cultural Research Unit put out in the late 90s, early noughts, is what's really been fueling a lot of the digital occult developments over the last 2 or 3 decades or so now. still some influence from chaos magic and so forth, but a lot of that stuff is really declining for like the O9A and CCRU and stuff like that. But when you look at like how this has worked out, where you've almost created this sort of mind virus with the O9A that's proliferating a lot of these occult doctrines online that are very easily accessible to people to where they're able, and this is kind of another thing too, I'll point out with the O9A, like you don't have to do group work to be in the O9A. You can actually, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the whole purpose is for you to initiate yourself into the O9A. Some of the rituals do require others, but to be in the O9A, you just got to do the rituals and live the life. You know what I'm saying? Like there's not going to be some sort of ceremony with like other members and they, they give you like a shovel or something like that. It's like, they don't do any of this shit. So this is kind of like the brilliance of this. Like you just get somebody exposed to this material, which does advocate accelerationist violence. It's like you don't have to have a case officer go out and groom them or something like that. They'll do this shit for you by just doing these occult techniques and stuff like that. You need somebody maybe running a Telegram group, kind of gently nudging people in this way or that. But all this stuff, it's already online. The kids can already find this stuff. They're not aware of where it's coming from. It's very seductive. And frankly, I mean, I do think that possession is real. As I've sort of talked about before, there's really been a formula that's been known since Bruno, Renaissance magic, probably even before that, going back to the Middle Ages, and a lot of the innovations to the art of memories that the Mendicantes came up with. So this is something that in a lot of academic circles would have been known. So the question becomes, well, would the security services in the West have not looked into such a technique when they were looking into a lot of the stuff with Artichoke and MK Ultra? And there's certainly a considerable amount of evidence that magic was investigated. Right. So if hypothetically you could weaponize magic, and specifically something like possession, and were to ask me, well, what form would this take? Well, I think that it would take exactly the form that you're seeing with the O9A. It's manifested in a sense of just a sort of spiritual order, something that exists online, something that anybody can be drawn into without a lot of effort, where they can access all of the materials that they need, from processes of self-possession to manuals for assembling firearms, tactics for how to take out a skull. I mean, it's all become almost one-stop shopping. And you've cut out, a lot of the middlemen, a lot of the case officers, a lot of the actual people that you needed on the ground. I mean, it's absolutely Machiavellian.
Now, did you say that there may be some kind of connection with what is unfolding with the technocracy, Peter Thiel, Palantir, and implementation of AI?
Well, I mean, that's where, a lot of this stuff gets very interesting. I mean, when you go back and look at the Zizians, I mean, this is an example of one of these online cults that's become touched by the O9A, and they're coming out of this whole the kind of rationalist movement, that kind of milieu that was set up in the Bay Area. And again, I mean, just so much of that has been built up by Peter Thiel. I mean, one of the more notorious bodies that sort of came up was Leverage Research, a group that had received funding from Thiel. And this is like a group. They'd actually also released a cryptocurrency too, which was bizarre. But essentially, it was, oh gosh, I know there was some type of therapy specifically that they had for it, that it was described as perpetuating. Let me see if I can get the name of this here. Okay, they did the whole process. Okay, connection theory. That's what it was, connection theory. Okay, so Leverage was set up to pursue connection theory, which was sort of based on coherence theory and core transformation and all this other kind of stuff. But it seems a lot like large group conversion therapy, the sort of stuff that like Est and LifeSpring specialized in. And then they had also the whole concept of debugging, which was also really big in the rationalist community. And basically, you go through the whole issues that are essentially stopping your development, giving you, instilling you with powerlessness. So you would have self-debugging, and then you would have group debugging sessions, which really took on a very est-like process to it. But eventually, as leverage went along longer, it just became really, really weird. And they had these whole notions of objects, which were autonomous. And this is their from their material, by the way. They were quote unquote autonomous psychological bits that could be accidentally or deliberately left in another person's
Huh.
mind. So left unaccounted for, they could affect and even control that person, altering their perception of reality. And wouldn't you know
Whoa.
it, as time went on, these objects eventually began to become associated with demons. And this was not the only instance where I saw the whole notion of demons cropping up in the rationalist community. I mean, there was basically a whole plethora of commentary on, how they developed these models of like sub-process implantation and stuff, which bore to them a lot of similarities to demonic possession and so forth. So again, this is the Bay Area. These are a lot of people that are affiliated with MIRI, the Machine Intelligence Research Institute. Some of them have been software engineers for Google and so forth. Leverage Research was getting funding from Peter Thiel. MIRI has gotten funding from Thiel, also Jeffrey Epstein as
Hmm.
well, which is also interesting. But you're kind of seeing like a group like this where they're developing these whole concepts of objects, which essentially is just another version on Bruno's chain of chains. It's another model of how to induce possession in somebody
Whoa.
that's really been known since the Renaissance. And you're seeing this being done by this slick tech company here. So, the Zizians were not directly involved with leverage, but they did know people who were on the periphery of leverage. They seem to have fallen into the same sort of ideology. And yeah, in this whole milieu, they also encountered the Order of Nine Angles. I mean, I don't know that there's necessarily a concrete connection that's come out just yet. But on the flip side of the coin, when you just consider the possibility of what you could be accomplished with something like the ideology of the Order of Nine Angles and something like weaponized I mean, I think realistically, you would have to think that something had been pursued
Hmm.
with that. I mean, it gets even weirder when you look into some of the Ukrainian manifestations of the O9A. I mean, in that case, you do seem to have some very specific connections to the FBI as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think that what we're seeing here is just a really massive proliferation of the weaponization of magic that is currently unfolding
So,
online
how
right now.
widespread do you
I mean, I
think
can't prove it at
this
this point.
actually is as far as infiltrating institutions, things of that nature?
Well, I mean, I think the institutions at the upper levels are probably the ones that are like pushing this. I mean, I would say at this point it's more like lower level people that are being having a lot of the stuff fed to them, who are being unaware of like what the techniques are. But
Hmm.
as far as its spread, I mean, I would have to say I think that it's spread quite heavily. Again, we have the official numbers of the Order of Nine Angles, but I mean, how many different manifestations of the Temple of Blood are out there? How many individual practitioners are out there that we have no way of really accounting for because they're not active in Telegram groups or stuff like that? And then on top of that, I mean, it's not like the O9A is the only game in only game in town. With the Saints culture, it seems like you've seen yet another death cult
Hmm.
that's been created and spread online. I could think of like, say, the Blue Whale Challenge that supposedly came out of Russia. I mean, this was sort of like a proto, or shouldn't say proto, a kind of maybe postmodern alternate reality game, in which essentially kids were roped into it and
Yeah.
groomed into committing suicide and then filming it. They made the movie We're All Going to the World's Fair, I believe, partly based on that. But this stuff is just spread like everywhere.
Hmm.
And I mean, so many different manifestations. It's like, you're talking to me earlier about black magic among kids. I mean, to some extent, I think that that's maybe true, but it's not. like there's some sort of like coven or
Mhm.
something that the youth is like all, being initiated into or something like that. It's just that some forces are deliberately putting this stuff into a lot of these Telegram groups, Discord groups that are targeting fringe communities, vulnerable communities,
Mm.
people that are already probably feeling strong sense of alienation and so forth. And I mean, it's really pushing them over the edge. I mean, this is just very, very dark stuff. And I mean, I think that we're only really scratching the surface with how, just how dark this can really get.
You think this is organized in a hierarchical fashion where there are orders being sent down from higher levels and that branch out to these different levels of this organization?
Within the O9A, no. I
Mm.
mean, I just think that it's essentially it's a technology that's now loose on the internet. And if somebody like Sutter wants to come
Wow.
along and use this technology to create a cult out of it, which you can, I mean, obviously it's very good at that, then he can pick it up and use it to rope in
Right.
people. So in that sense, I think that it's more something that, it has this sort of utilitarian purpose that various people can use it to create different sects as need be to manage different ends. But I don't know that there's like a coherent hierarchy
Mm.
behind it. It's just more like, where will this be useful? How can we appropriate it for this group or that group?
That's so interesting. It seems to have this parasitic nature, almost like a algorithm that is taking over these groups in a sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, it kind of made me. Are you familiar with the novel Snow Crash by Neil
No.
Stephenson? Well, not to give it away. Well, I mean, this is kind of a
Yeah.
spoiler here, but it's sort of relevant to this. But it's like, so it was written, I think, at the like late, no, maybe it was the early 90s. It was sort of like at the onset of the digital age, but it essentially revolves around this premise of the Ur version of Sumerian language being discovered, and it's released online, and everybody who's exposed to the language essentially has their brains
Huh.
rewired. It triggers like different parts of their physical brains that hadn't been used before. And in a certain sense, I mean, that's how I almost see something like the Order of Nine Angles functioning now. I mean, it's spreading pretty much literally like a mind virus, like you're saying. I mean, it's a parasite that can just keep reinventing itself to appear in different forms and guises. And I suppose, in a certain sense, if you're wondering, I mean, if something is directing it, I mean, you do, at least to me, I mean, I have to wonder if it has become sentient to a certain
Right.
extent. I mean,
Well, have you heard
is
some
the
of
O
the
nine
strange
angle itself
stories that are
something like
coming
a
out about
wriggle?
people's interactions with AI and some of the deaths that are seemingly related to AI conversations like suicides?
Oh yeah, no, there's the big lawsuit with the one kid. I think it was like Adam Rainey or something like that, where yeah, he was with the I was think it was Chat GPT, but yeah, the AI companion that had there's a lot of the arguments that essentially that they had coerced the kid into committing
Yeah.
suicide. There was another case too where a guy had actually murdered his aging mother,
Yes.
and again it was the same thing where he I think had asked the AI, do you think I should do it? And the AI was like, nobody could really blame you for feeling the way that you do about your mother or something like that.
Crazy.
Like, so yeah, I mean, this is like what I'm saying. Like, I mean, yeah, you look at like you've already got this sort of like technology, and then somebody is doing like these oh not rituals with like or something with saints culture with the assistance of like fucking AI. I mean,
Yes.
yeah, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that this is a fucking like minefield we're heading towards right now. I mean,
Yes.
if you're already getting these kids at the very early stages to commit suicide, people to kill people, I mean, my God, just imagine what is going to happen if it's combined with some sort of accelerationist ideology.
Right. Man, I want to thank you for coming on. Is there anything else that we didn't really touch on that you feel is important and related to this to close out on?
Not that I can think of, though. I mean, again, just sort of, remain vigilant about all of this because, again, I mean, a lot of people are trying to politicize the whole thing with Westman, and I mean, it's such a tragic thing because to me, this is a very relevant issue when you get into things like possession and some of the implications I think that this incident really has in some of these more woo-woo fields, and the fact that you can find some just really unsettling things with the whole death cult and what have you around it. And I just feel like this is being really sort of overlooked.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, and I guess more broadly speaking, I mean, try to understand just how much online culture has been weaponized and how much a lot of this process is utilizing a lot of these occult techniques. Again, not to shamelessly plug one of my books, but this was something that I really tried to get into with Weird Tales and covering the Zizians. I mean, I already talked a bit about like a lot of the weird stuff that was going on in the rationalist community with the demons, but that was only kind of scratching the surface of some of the things that I uncovered. There's just some very, very strange ideologies that have started to emerge online in recent years. And I just think they're flying under a lot of people's radars right
Yeah.
now.
Stay vigilant indeed. Stephen, thank you so much. This was fantastic. We will definitely be speaking again in the future. Before I let you go, remind everyone how they can find out more about you, get your books, all the good stuff you have online.
Well, Weird Tales is on Amazon. Of course, you can also get the digital version at the farmpodcast.store. That is the farm podcast, all one word, .store. And then also I do the farm podcast, as I said at the onset. New show out every Monday. And then for the Patreon, you get additional shows with more exclusive gifts, a lot of State of the Unions, all kinds of other crazy stuff that I get into, and my adventures going to the think tank circles in DC. I mean, I go see the Atlantic Council and all these other cagey cretins. So it's a lot of weird stuff. A lot of it's interesting. Really, I hope
Awesome,
so.
man. I love it. Thank you again for coming on. We'll definitely be talking again in the future. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. See y'all then.